Cool. All right. Hey, folks. Uh, so today might be short or long one, not too sure. Bit of a looser agenda for today. We're not coming with any really planned topics in place as far as what we want to talk about. Just kind of put together a loose agenda today of maybe looking at some of the stuff that will be coming up in the 7.3 release, which will probably come out over the next couple weeks. And might also talk a little bit about prototypes and kind of where our thoughts are with that. There's a lot of just kind of brainstorming that we're thinking about right now, and yeah, a couple other things as well. Also, the community survey is still going on. Like if you go to the main website, of course, the link to the community survey is up here. So it's still there. We'll probably take it down somewhat soon. No, I think firm date on that, but if you haven't done it yet, please do it because we do look at it, review it, and we always get a lot of good information. I've personally been having a lot of fun looking at a lot of the data that's already been coming in, just as far as, especially what's in the feature request field. I find people write very interesting stuff in there, and it's been interesting to see what people write, what different feature requests people have as well. So yeah, community survey. Um, and yeah, so 7.3 is obviously the next release that we're going to do. And if people in the community are ever interested in seeing hey, what are y'all planning on putting in 7.3 release, going to the main repo, issues, hitting the milestones button, you'll usually see one or two versions out. We usually like to plan what we're trying to do right now, so what might be in a current sprint, and then we might, if we know things aren't going to land in this one, we might just shuffle them over to that milestone just as a placeholder. But yeah, you can always look at this to kind of get a general idea what it is that we're working on. And of course, there is also always the project.concourse.ci.org portion of the website, which is kind of like a Kanban board of all the different epics that we're working on. So we might talk about these prototype and this spike for resource causality in a little bit. But yeah, so obviously some stuff is actually already landed. This is an interesting one if for anyone that's using Containerd. There was a bug where users were essentially seeing if they had a task that didn't output anything for some period of time, usually whatever their worker rebalance interval was, which if you don't know what that was, the default is 1 hour. So if they had some task that ran for longer than 1 hour and it didn't output anything, the job would just fail for some reason. So I think we fixed that. It was kind of a weird issue to debug, but should hopefully be fixed. We also made a change to, if anyone's using the Bosch release, there will be some changes to BBR as well. So hopefully make it a little bit more robust. We found out that some customers would sometimes run into issues where they might have to run BBR more than once. So we just updated the job so it's a little more resilient. If it sees that it failed, it'll try 3 times to do the backup essentially. So that's the thing there. Supporting reordering instance pipelines. I'm actually not 100% sure where this is right now, but for anyone that's not sure what this looks like, if you have an instance group like this, you'll notice that you can't click and drag any of the pipelines in here. It just, it just does some text highlighting, but you can't actually drag it around. Like if you do on the main page here, you can drag your pipelines around. You can't do that in instance groups. So some stuff in the works to get that working on the UI. I'm assuming looks like Aidan is working on it. And yeah, I don't know, Aidan, if you have anything you want to say or share about that, or is it just coming along? Nice, cool. Yeah. And I don't think I'll call it any of these other bugs, but of course, people are interested in them. You can always look at the milestone and see what we're doing. Uh, and yeah, I think one other thing, I spent a little bit of time this morning. I'm going to try and actually see if I can make this a bit more of a consistent thing whenever we uh, do the office hours here, is just kind of call out some of the community PRs that are interesting or have some really good like quality of life improvements. This is one that came to mind for me. A little bit of like recency bias here, actually 17 days ago. But yeah, this is a neat, pretty cool uh, addition. Nothing too fancy, but essentially bringing the container limits, which is something you can configure inside a task configuration file. So what would be inside the file here? But now there's like a top level, a step level way of overriding that as well. So yeah, so you have two ways of doing it. So you can override the params in a task config, and you can also override the container limits uh, in there as well. So pretty simple thing, but people may really like that for whatever reason. Yeah. And yeah, it was kind of hard to actually find a whole bunch of other PRs. There are a bunch of other ones like small fixes and such, but I thought that was a kind of interesting, notable one that people may be interested in. So yeah, so I think we'll jump over to. Oh no, please go. Actually, if anybody else has an interesting PR they can think of, please. Oh yeah, that is pretty neat. So people would probably end up seeing a little bit of a performance improvement because essentially the cache volume is getting spread throughout all the workers a lot more, if I'm understanding it correctly. I haven't looked at this one myself. Yeah, I know it's been a bit of a long one because I think we had to revert it at one point because of the issue with Darwin and Windows workers that our pipelines caught. Mm. Yeah, this is one of those tricky ones, I guess, to test, right? Because you can only really test it when you have multiple workers, and that's kind of a tough one to test because you need to test the entire system, basically, right? Mm, gotcha. Oh yeah, all right, that's pretty cool. Yeah, so maybe feature flagged because maybe a little experimental until all the edge cases are caught. That is a pretty cool one. Thanks for calling it out, Aidan. Any other good PRs actually that people have on top of mind that's they're in the middle of reviewing? All right, I'll take that as no, nothing else, which is cool. All right. So we have two paths we can take here, folks. Talk about prototypes or talk about the resource causality flow. Um, talk about prototypes first, maybe. Yeah, cool. Thanks. Actually, yeah. FYI, I can't see anybody just given my setup. So if anyone's ever giving me thumbs up or nodding, I cannot see that. But cool. Yeah. But yeah, prototypes. Yeah, so if folks don't know, this is a bit of a one to kind of like wrap your head around. I know I've read the RFC a couple times and like I understand it a little bit better each time myself because it is a bit of a abstract idea, I guess. It's a very cool idea, but it's very abstract. I'm personally a little scared to try and explain it, but yeah, there is this RFC here. If you just go to the RFC's repo, you'll see RFC 37 prototypes. You can look at this file and it essentially, yeah, it explains it in detail. Alex, I don't know if you have a nice succinct way of explaining prototypes. Yeah, yeah, I think that covers it pretty well. Gives the idea that essentially, again, sticking with like a container and then, yeah, essentially making a better interface, yeah, out of the resource interface where it's like an interface for an interface in a way. It allows us to make other interfaces based on this interface. Oh no, really? Oh, this is a good point. I forgot to look that. It's capturing my microphone, but it's not capturing anybody else's. Oh no. Let me see what I messed up in my thing. I should. Oh, I know what I did wrong. This is what happens when you have a thing of too many things. Select a speaker. That one. Someone say something now?
Hello.
There we go. Cool.
Want me to go again?
I guess so. I guess so. I'll edit
Cool.
that in post as well, just
Sure.
'cause. But yeah,
Uh,
from
let
the
me.
top, Alex,
Sure.
what are prototypes? Can you explain what prototypes are to me?
Well, Taylor, prototypes are a generalization of the resource protocol that we have today. So if you look on the docs on Concourse CI, there's like implementing a resource type page. And that kind of covers like a set of 3 commands. There's opt resource in, opt resource check, opt resource out, and they take a JSON request on standard in and print out a JSON request on standard out. That's how resource types are implemented. Prototypes are kind of just a generalization of that, where instead of having these fixed 3 commands and like a fixed absolute path in the container with like a fixed like JSON request response flow, you can have a prototype that implements arbitrary commands um, and accepts arbitrary objects. They're literally just called object on the protocol, and emits other objects in response. So one difference is you can emit multiple objects in response. That's how check would work. So with prototypes, we would start transitioning resource types to be implemented as resource prototypes. And that would work by implementing check, get, and put commands. But what's neat is it's more general than resources, so you can just run them directly. There will be a run step where you can just run an arbitrary action. That's a way of delivering like packageable, distributable tasks, but as prototypes instead, which has been sort of a long request. Tasks you can kind of package up and distribute and use generically right now, but it's a little awkward because all the parameterization goes through environment variables, so you're much more restricted in what kinds of data structures you can pass along. You also have to like carry around a config, which is kind of awkward compared to resource types, which you just configure them in the pipeline and then use them later. So in addition to resources and reusable tasks, we plan to use this as sort of the foundation for kind of like all future pipeline abstractions. That would work by having Concourse just saying, if you have a prototype that implements check, get, and put for these different shapes of objects, then you can use it as a resource. You can also run commands directly, or one of the things we're doing right now is adding the get var step and having it so that var sources, instead of being natively implemented in Concourse, they're implemented through prototypes. That way you're not tied to whatever set of credential managers we have baked into the Concourse version. You can actually package it up with your Concourse pipeline and have it be more portable. And we can also run var source actions on workers, which is nice because then you can use like EC2 like IAM roles. I always forget what the correct string of 3 words there is, but basically like worker configured access to credentials, which is another long ask. So we've been preventing merging those kinds of things into resource types like S3 and Semver because it would break the policy of resources being like completely self-contained in what's their source. If resources were able to discover their own credentials, we wouldn't be able to guarantee that someone can access the shared version history because they're not putting in the credentials. But if we have var sources that run on workers, fetch the credentials and feed those into resources, now we can have like the still like technically correct resource definitions that allows us to efficiently share version history and reduce the checking overhead. But yeah, beyond resources and tasks and var sources, this is just sort of the new foundation for future community provided extensions to Concourse. And we might discover more uses for this in the future. But the nice thing is the protocol is so generic that maybe people implement these patterns and then we give like a Concourse interpretation of them. So for example, like if you implement a notify action, maybe we add first class notification support to Concourse pipelines, and suddenly all those prototypes you can have tied in a more semantic way in a pipeline. Is there anything I said before that I didn't cover in the recap? I forget.
No, I think that was even better than the first time, actually.
Cool. Should do that more often.
Yeah, just do it, say it twice. Say it twice. But yeah, so yeah, prototypes will be pretty cool. The interface for interfaces, and yeah, it'll be interesting to see what other abstractions we end up pulling out of it. Because yeah, like the notification one, that could be a interesting one. And I guess the nice thing too is that there's actually a very clear path as well for all the resources. Because essentially the resources don't actually have to change, I think, besides maybe some of this like the info request might have to be a thing that might have to be added. But other than that, all like the existing like check in and out scripts would still be the same, right?
There are small adjustments to the protocol and the way that they emit responses. For example, you write a response to a file instead of to standard out.
Hmm.
So there probably would be some changes necessary. Well, there definitely would be. Also because we don't hard code the opt resource in out check. But the migration should be able to be pretty gradual. We're not going to just suddenly stop supporting V1 resources. We'll support them side by side, and we'll be able to tell really easily which protocol to use because you'll either configure under resource types or prototypes. And I don't think there'd be a pressure for a timeline to remove support for V1 resources. So I think it's something the community can sort of gradually transition to, and there's more functionality that prototype-based resources will be able to leverage. So I think there should be enough incentive to get the community gradually migrating over.
Cool. Aidan, I don't know if you want to maybe just go over some of the different options as far as like what a prototype-based step will look like. Um, that might just be interesting to just to get people an idea of what it'll kind of start looking like to write this. Or actually, I don't. I know Alex, you had started trying to convert that one job, so maybe even displaying that. I don't know if either of y'all have that handy. You've got something one of you could show.
Uh, yeah, maybe. It's probably a good idea to get some feedback. One thing I like as a preface to that, one thing we were thinking about or have been thinking about is kind of how inputs and outputs will like how you'll be able to configure inputs and outputs for prototypes. So one thing that Alex didn't touch on explicitly when talking about like the reusable tasks side of things is that another benefit over just sharing a task config around is that you can have dynamic sets of inputs and outputs. So you're not fixed to whatever is specified in the task config. So what we're trying to think about is how do you express when I run this reusable step, a reusable task sort of thing? How do you provide the inputs that you want to that prototype? And then conversely, how does the prototype express these are the outputs that I've emitted? So yeah, that's kind of some context there. I don't know. I don't know if
Yep.
I don't
No,
really have anything prepared to share.
I can maybe
right
show
now.
the gist of like one mockup that I converted, the one that I showed you, Aidan.
Yep.
Let me bring that into a new window real quick.
Cool. All right.
Taking over the screen share.
Yeah. Let me see if I can get this right. Whoop. Oh, wait.
I'm watching the stream.
Ooh, I kind of did it. I kind of did it. Oh, yeah. Okay. That's close enough. Yeah. If you make it wider, that'll make
Oh,
it look
sure.
better on there. Yep. It looks good. There you go. Yeah, actually, yeah. So whoever ends up doing screen sharing, if you have your window maximized, the ratio will just work better. If you're just doing like a half screen thing, like I know probably most of us do, it won't scale super well.
Wait, is
If you
that?
want to zoom in on the text there, it would probably help as well. It's kind
I'm
of hard.
looking at the YouTube and it doesn't look quite right for me.
Oh yeah, wait, that's right. Sorry. There you go.
Cool.
It'll transition. There you go.
So this is just one idea I've been throwing around and kind of going over with Aidan. I think what we'll probably do is submit a follow-up RFC to amend the prototypes protocol because we have sort of three options to go over. Where like nothing here is solid and set in stone, but the basic theory I'm kind of pulling on here and some of the motivation is to get rid of the somewhat implicit artifact scope So the way it works right now is you run a get step, and the get step has a name, and it'll fetch the resource, and it'll register the artifact that it fetched under the name of the get step. And then you run a task step later, and if it has an input name that matches that artifact name, that artifact will be passed to it. One thing that's not so great about that is it can be very hard to tell what artifacts are going where. It's very easy to have like just 4 get steps, and then you run a task, and then you run another task, and like 3 of those inputs are going into the first task, and then that task is actually under the hood generating an output, and that output name matches an input name in the other task. So it's kind of hard to like go into a pipeline and see where things are flowing. And it's also kind of hard to optimize things like the put step. I guess we have something called inputs detect, and the way that works is it'll look for the params in the put step and look for anything that looks like a path that matches an input name, and then it'll mount only those inputs. But the default behavior right now is to take every single artifact and put it into the put container, which can be very slow if you have large artifacts or many workers. So some of the motivation here is to make it more explicit and get rid of the sort of separate artifact scope so that everything is just a var instead, and actually store artifacts as vars. There's some special syntax here for like at foo. You can pretend that's just referencing an artifact. I have some notes in here saying it's equivalent to a local var, but none of this is really decided right now. So the way this would technically work is get concourse would be sort of shorthand for run get, type whatever the prototype is. Params would be the union of source, the version, and the get params if you specified any. And then the magic sauce would be that you set vars. So set vars resource concourse means take the response object, take the resource field, and set it as a concourse name, as a var named concourse. That way, later on in the build plan, you would refer to this through like at concourse to pass it into something. So here, for example, we run the build fly command using the Concourse CI prototype. One thing to cover there is we're kind of seeing a future where instead of having just like a bunch of one-off tasks, you actually build a prototype specialized for CI, like your own CI that just has all the commands that you need to run in your pipeline. This is kind of analogous to a lot of people are building images in their pipeline at the very beginning and passing them along, and that image just contains all their dependencies for their CI, and then they base all their tasks off of it. What I'm kind of hoping to see is that instead of just using that image and building tasks off of it, you actually sort of build an interface for all the things that you need to run in your pipeline, and then you just invoke commands instead, and then you can pass things in as params. So I think there's a possible future if we make it easy enough to write prototypes that there just aren't tasks anymore and everything is prototypes. And I think there's a few pretty good benefits to that in terms of code reusability and just having stronger interfaces and possibly better testing. Maybe you can even write tests for these things. But yeah, so the way this would work is you pass the Concourse artifact in as a param. Concourse would see that this points to an artifact, and then when it creates the container, it would set up the appropriate mounts, and then the prototype would just receive a path to the artifact. So from a prototype's perspective, it'd be pretty similar to how things are today. You pass in a param and it points to a path. The only difference is Concourse explicitly knows that it's an artifact, sets up a mount for it, instead of us just sort of putting every single artifact into the container and having these names coincide with relative paths from the working directory that we run it in. And then the prototype can emit an artifact in its response like this. So it would just print out an object in the response. It would say fly is this special object artifact, and then a path relative to the prototype's output directory. Concourse would see this, and then we see when you say set var, it would set this basically the same way that the get step worked. It would know that this is a special type of object, and it would store some sort of data type that has the volume plus the path relative to the volume. And then when we pass that as an input, we would set up a mount corresponding to it. I think that's pretty much it. But yeah, The main thing is sort of storing artifacts as a special type in the var scope and doing away with the artifact repository. I say this not thinking at all about backwards compatibility, just for now, for the sake of like discussing the concept. We obviously wouldn't do this in a way that like breaks all of today's pipelines. Maybe this is just functionality that you can use with prototypes. Maybe we find a way for it to work with tasks. I have no idea. We're kind of just spitballing here and figuring out what kinds of patterns would be nice and the most flexible for working with prototypes in the future. I think that's it.
Cool.
That's all I got for prototypes.
Nice. Yeah. It's very early days, I guess, as far as this stuff goes. Good job calling out that's like, yeah, this is not like the definite end, because yeah, there's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
When you start getting into the weeds.
And like I said, we'll probably put another RFC for this, which if we're done with like the prototype input outputs discussion, I could segue to RFC and governance, or I could hand it back the screen share.
Nah, I'm good with that actually, yeah. Unless
Just
anybody else has anything else they want to say.
It'll just be a brief update, so we could also just go back to it. I just have the screen share up already, so I figured it'd be efficient.
Take advantage of it? Sure.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Very quick update. The front page is updated now if you haven't seen it. Now we show the top most voted RFCs up here. The goal of this is to collect feedback. I think I might have gone over like these ideas in the previous or N-2 office hours. So this is just saying it's out there now. The RFC process is much more documented now. We cover what is the scope of the RFC process, so when you would need to submit something. And we've also recently assigned every single open RFC to a member of the core team, and we're going to start burning through that backlog and reviewing things and hopefully getting things to resolution. Also, governance, we're very close to being able to open up the maintainers team to anyone to apply. And once that's done, and once there's more documentation out there, I plan to have some sort of announcement saying, here's our governance model.
Cool.
That's it. That's all I got.
Nice. That's awesome. All right. I guess I'll take back the screen sharing just so the Zoom layout doesn't look too janky like it is right now. Change everything back. Transition. There we go. Kind of. Yay. There. I got it back. Things will pop back up on the screen. Cool. All right. I guess that's prototypes. And that's what we're thinking about them so far. The only other thing that if we want to, we don't have to. But Daniel, I know you've been at least spending a little bit of time. I know not yesterday because we were pairing yesterday and we were not working on this. But the resource causality stuff, I don't know if there's anything that you can really have to share at this point. If not, totally fine. But yeah, what's going on with your spike on resource causality, or even just what is that briefly?
Yeah, sure. So resource causality is basically asking the questions is that given a particular resource version, what created that version? So for example, if we have a git commit, we want to figure out all the images that are built off that particular git commit, or maybe it's the other way around. Like given I have an image SHA, what were the git commits that are used to create this image? Right now, all that information is available through the UI. You could do like a lot of clicking into builds and then tracing through the output resources and all that. But it'd be nice to just have a one unified screen where it's like, where it's of emphasis on resource versions, and then it shows how they flow between the two. Still very early in the planning stages right now, open to feedback. Anybody can comment on this issue with any sort of suggestions, feature requests, and etc.
Yeah. Whoa. Are you working on just trying to get that information through the database right now, actually? Is that kind of your starting point here?
Yeah, so I guess about that. We have two ways of doing it. So one way is we could use the concourse idea of the path constraint, where because we know resource flows from job to job via using the patch constraint. We can sort of visualize it based off that. The other option is to base it off the resource itself and the version that's generated. So this second scenario will cover cases where you might have forgotten a patch constraint, or the constraint is not explicit, but it's still like indirectly passed through to another build, or maybe even like, I don't think we're going to be doing separate pipelines for now. So you'll be like within a single pipeline, any resource and all the dependent resource that it generates from there.
Cool. All right. So yeah, pretty early days, but yeah, I guess if people have feedback, like there's this initial issue, which I guess people can look through as well to see what's already been said, and then if they have any new thoughts or ideas, issue 6904, the main Concourse repo. Oh, and people didn't see how I got here because I didn't click the right things in OBS. I'm still learning, but from the project page, I just clicked this, and it takes me to this page. I don't know if you have any actually. There's a little bar down here for people that don't know. Uh, this is kind of like our way of putting issues inside other issues. So like Kanban board inside. I think this actually links to like GitHub project, but yeah, there could be more details in here. You can see Daniel's been dropping a bunch of notes in here as well. So if people are interested, they can. Yeah, lots of details in all sorts of places on the project site. Yeah. Thanks for the summary, Daniel. That was good. Does anybody else have something they would like to share?
I just wanted to give one last plug for the Concourse community survey. We got quite a few responses so far, but we could probably use a few more. So you can find it in the usual locations. We have a link on the Concourse CI site. You can find it on Discord if you're there, or on Twitter. We have links as well. In the coming weeks and months, I will probably do an office hours where we go over some of the results and some of the feedback that we learned from it. So if you have a chance and you haven't filled it out yet, be very well appreciated.
Yeah, do it. All right. I guess that is it then for office hour. So thank you everyone for joining, and see you next time. 2 weeks, Thursdays. Bye.